Whoa, whoa. Set it down, Grandma. That's more rifle than you've ever seen. It'll knock you flat, and then I'll be doing paperwork all week. The sergeant's voice carried the whole length of the firing line, pitched to reach the families behind the yellow rope and the students in front of him, and it did what he wanted it to do. They laughed. It was the middle of the afternoon on the last Saturday of the month, the base range thrown open for families, and the heat came off the gravel in slow waves that bent the flags at the 400-meter line into lazy ribbons. On the bench under the canopy sat the rifle everyone had come to see, the long black shape of an M82 50 caliber, and beside it, with one weathered hand still resting on the bipod, stood an old woman in a plain red jacket. She did not set it down the way he expected. She did not fumble at it, or snatch her hand back, or look embarrassed at being caught. She simply looked at the rifle for a moment, reached over, and drew the bolt back with one short, practiced motion. The chamber was clear. She let the bolt ride home, thumbed the safety, and settled the whole 11 kilograms of steel flat and square on the sandbag, the bipod legs even, the muzzle pointed cleanly downrange. Then she took her hand away and folded both hands in front of her and stepped back behind the line. She had only reached out because the bipod was skewed. One leg had slipped off the bag, and the rifle sat canted, and something in her had not been able to leave it that way. That was all. She had not meant to touch anything, but the touching had been noticed, and the noticing had become the joke, and now the joke belonged to the sergeant. His name was Brett Salas, and he was 26 years old, a range coach with a fresh haircut and a voice built for crowds. He wore his uniform the way some young men wear a good afternoon, like it would last forever. He grinned at his students and jerked a thumb back at the old woman. See that? That's how you end up on the safety brief. Everybody give the nice lady some room. More laughter. A corporal near the back, Colby Resnick, 22, had his phone up and turned sideways, filming the grandma who tried to lift the 50. The old woman did not seem to hear any of it. She had turned her face toward the range and was watching the flags. Up in the tower, the range master lowered his coffee. His name was Odell Prentice, 64 years old, retired master gunnery sergeant, and he had run this line for 9 years and spent 20 years on gun teams before that. He had watched 10,000 people handle weapons on this range, and most of them handled a rifle the way a man handles a snake. He has been told is not poisonous. He knew what fear looked like on the bench, and boredom and swagger, and he knew the rare fourth thing, the flat, quiet competence that did not perform for anyone. And he had just watched an old woman in a red jacket clear a 50 caliber rifle with that fourth thing. He set the coffee down. Now where, he said, to no one in particular, to the young Marine standing watch beside him. Does an old gal learn to clear a 50 like that? The young Marine shrugged. He had not seen it. Almost no one had. On a firing line, the only people who notice how a weapon is handled are the ones who have handled 10,000 of them, and there was exactly one of those on the range that afternoon, and he was already coming down the tower stairs. Down on the line, the old woman watched the flags bend and thought about nothing, which was a skill she had spent a lifetime learning. The wind was coming 10 degrees off the left, quartering, and it was picking up a fishtail down at the berm where the ground fell away. She noted it the way another woman her age might note that it looked like rain. Then she put her hands in the pockets of the red jacket and settled in to watch a boy who did not know the wind teach other boys who did not know the wind. And she kept her peace, because she had long ago run out of any need to be the one who was right. That, she thought, was the gift of getting old. You stopped needing to be right out loud. She had not planned to come. The flyer for the open house had sat on her kitchen counter for 3 weeks, under the phone bill and the seed catalog, and she had told herself she would not go. It was the anniversary week. It was always harder in the anniversary week, the last days of a February that lived in her more sharply than any month that had come after it. And a smart woman stayed home in the anniversary week and worked in the garden and let the days pass. But that morning she had put on the red jacket and driven out through the gate with the visitor pass on the dash, because 35 years is a long time to keep away from the one kind of ground where she had ever felt entirely herself. And an old woman is allowed, once in a while, to stand near a firing line in the sun and remember without having to explain the remembering to anyone. She had only meant to watch. She had meant to be no one at all. She would have kept that peace all afternoon. But the sergeant, having found a laugh, could not leave it alone. He set a student behind the 50 for the 600-meter steal and called the wind for him. "Wind's nothing today," Salas said. "Hold center. Send it." The round went out with the deep flat crack the big rifle makes, and downrange, low and left of the steel, a puff of dirt jumped off the berm. The steel did not ring. Salas clicked his tongue and shook his head at the student. "You yanked it. I told you. Wind's nothing." That was all you. Behind the line, quietly, almost to herself, the old woman spoke. "Wind's not nothing." Salas turned. "What was that?" "You've got 10 off the left from those far flags," she said, not raising her voice, her eyes still on the range. "And a fishtail coming up off the berm. That's not a center hold. That's 1.5 mil into it. Maybe a hair more on a cold barrel. He didn't yank it. You held him wrong." For a moment, nobody said anything. The words were quiet, but they were exact. And exactness has a weight that volume does not. Resnick laughed first to break it. "Oh, Grandma's got dope now," he said, delighted. Filming. "Grandma's calling wind." The old woman said nothing more. She had said the true thing once, and once was enough, and she went back to the flags. Prentice reached the bottom of the tower stairs and stopped 10 feet from her. He had come down to move her along, the way you move any curious visitor back from a hot bench. But he had heard what she said, and now he was not moving anyone anywhere. He was looking at her collar. There was a cord there, a worn bootlace gone gray with age, disappearing under the collar of the red jacket. And where it showed, at her throat, hung a small, dull object, a thumb-sized cylinder of tarnished steel, and Prentice had seen that object exactly twice in his life. Once around the neck of a Vietnam-era gun team leader who had trained him, and once in a glass case at the sniper school, and both times he had been told, quietly, what it was and what it cost to wear one. He did not say anything, not yet. But he stopped seeing an old woman who had wandered too close to the bench and started seeing something else. "Master Guns," he murmured, too low for the students, mostly to himself. "That's a hog's tooth." The old woman's eyes flicked to him, just once, and then away. She did not confirm it. She did not need to. Prentice stood very still with the recognition working through him. He had spent 9 years watching people pretend on this range, watching men buy the gear and the patches and the aggressive haircuts and stand behind a rifle wearing a costume of competence they had never earned. And he had gotten very good at telling the costume from the thing itself. This was the thing itself. It was in the way she had cleared the 50 without looking at it, the way her eyes lived on the flags instead of on the crowd, the way she had said, 1.5 mil, the way other people say good morning. You did not learn that at a gun store. You learned it in the only school that teaches it, over years, in places that leave marks. And the small, dull tooth at her collar was the sort of mark that particular school hands out to almost no one. He decided, standing there, that he would not let anything happen to her on his range. He did not yet know how badly he would be tested on that decision inside the next 10 minutes. The next student got behind the rifle. This time, Salas, stung and unwilling to show it, muttered a correction under his breath and set the hold a little into the wind after all, almost exactly where the old woman had said. The round went out. Downrange the steel rang, a clean, bright note that carried back across the grass, and the little crowd behind the rope made an appreciative noise. "There you go," Salas said, loud again, covering. "That's what I'm talking about. Read the wind." He did not look at the old woman when he said it. She had already looked away. She had been right, and he had known she was right, and he had used what she said and taken the credit. And any Marine who has spent an afternoon on a range knows that this is the exact moment an afternoon begins to turn against a man, though it takes him a long while to feel it turning. Salas felt it, though. Somewhere under the haircut and the voice, he felt the ground shift, and like a great many young men before him, he decided the way to fix it was to make the old woman smaller. "Tell you what," he called, sweeping an arm toward the bench with exaggerated courtesy, playing to the rope line. "Since we've got an expert with us today, come on up, ma'am. Show us how it's done. Big rifle, big talk, let's see it. Come on." "I'm just here to watch, Sergeant," the old woman said. "Course you are." He grinned at his students. "Annie Oakley here's just here to watch." The students laughed. Most of them. Not all of them. Down at the end of the line, a very young Marine, Private First Class Wyatt Bowden, 19 years old, and 3 weeks to the fleet, did not laugh. He was watching the old woman, and what he was watching was the thing that had already stopped the range master cold, though the private did not have the years to name it. She did not flinch. The sergeant kept swinging, and every swing landed on her and slid off, and the private found that unsettling in a way he could not explain. "You get lost from the museum tour?" Salas said. "Senior Center's field trip take a wrong turn? Careful with the loud noises, ma'am. Might knock the batteries out of your hearing aid." The rope line laughed. Resnick narrated for the phone, and the old woman stood in her red jacket and took all of it with the stillness of a stone in a creek, and the water went over her and around her and did not move her at all. And it was that, more than anything, that made the boy with the phone slowly stop laughing. Because you can mock a person who reacts. The reaction is the whole game. But there is no game against a person who simply lets it pass over them like weather. And somewhere in his gut, Resnick began to feel that he was filming something he did not understand. Private Bowden felt it too, more sharply, because he was closer, and because he was 19 and had not yet built the calluses that let older men laugh at things they should not. He kept looking at the old woman's boots. They were field boots, broken in over years and cared for. The leather dark and supple at the ankle where a person's boots only go supple if they have spent a very long time in them. And something about those boots under the plain slacks and the ordinary red jacket did not fit the joke the sergeant was telling. Boys who joined the Marine Corps at 18 learned fast to read boots. Bowden looked at hers, and then he looked at how she stood. Weight even, hands quiet, spine straight without effort. And he thought, without having any way to prove it, that his sergeant was making a mistake he could not take back. He wanted to say something. He did not know what an 18-year-old could possibly say to a sergeant on a live range, so he said nothing, and hated himself a little for it, and kept watching. Prentice stepped in, lightly, the way a range master does. "Sergeant Salas, run your relay. Let's keep the line moving." Salas heard it as the old man taking the joke's side, and he was not ready to lose his crowd to a retired gunny with a clipboard. "We're good, gunny," he said, with a smile that had an edge in it now. "Just having a little fun." "Right, ma'am." The old woman did not answer. She was watching the flags again. She had watched flags on 4 continents. She had lain motionless in the open for 19 hours once, on a slope of gravel with the sun crossing the whole sky above her, to earn a single shot, and a sunny afternoon of a boy's jokes did not register on the same scale as that. But no one on the line knew that yet, except the range master, who was beginning to be afraid. Not for her. If you have ever watched the young make sport of someone who earned the right to their silence, stay with this one and subscribe to the Veteran Vault, because what this boy does not know is about to find him. It stopped being a joke by degrees, the way these things do, and then all at once, Salas decided, somewhere in the back of his pride, that the old woman was the problem. Not his wind call, not the missed steal. Her. She was standing too close to his bench, unsettling his line, drawing eyes he wanted on himself, and the cleanest way to win the afternoon back was to remove her from it. "All right, ma'am. I'm going to need you back behind the rope," he said. And this time there was no courtesy in it, exaggerated or otherwise. "This is a live bench. Civilians don't crowd the firing line. You're done up here. Let's go." "I'm behind the line, Sergeant," the old woman said. And she was. She had not moved past it once. "You're done," he said. "Behind the rope. Now." And he took her by the arm. He took her by the upper arm, above the elbow, the way you steer someone who you have decided does not merit asking twice. And he began to turn her toward the rope line. She did not resist him. That was the strange part, the part he would replay for a long time afterward. She did not pull away, and she did not stiffen, and she did not make a scene. She simply set her feet. Her boots. She was wearing old field boots under the plain slacks, he noticed for the first time, not the shoes of a woman who had wandered in from a museum tour. Her boots settled into the gravel, and her free hand came down flat and certain on the rail of the bench, and the sergeant found, without at all understanding why, that he had taken hold of something that was fixed to the earth. He pulled, and nothing came. She let him hold her arm. She had let worse men hold worse, but the ground she stood on had become, in the space of a breath, a firing position, built out of 40 years of muscle that had not forgotten a single thing, and he could feel it in his hand, even if he could not name it. "Ma'am," he said, and some of the crowd voice had gone out of him. Under her breath, steadying herself the way a shooter steadies before a press, she read the line aloud, almost tenderly, the private words of a lifetime. 600 to the steel, 10 off the left, Mirage running left to right, 2 flags of Boyle. It was not for him. It was the litany of 100 firing points, the thing her mouth did when her body built a position, and it came out of her without thought. Behind the rope, a father pulled his small daughter back a step. Resnick kept filming, but he had stopped narrating. And down the line, Private Bowden took a half step forward, his mouth opening, and then stopped, because he was 19. And the man with his hand on the old woman was a sergeant. And there is a great weight in that for a boy 3 weeks to the fleet. Nobody stopped Salas. Nobody on that whole crowded range stopped him. That was the part that would sit worst, with all of them later, the parents and the students, and the corporal with the phone. That a young man had put his hand on an old woman in front of 100 people, and 100 people had watched, because he wore the stripes and the certainty. And certainty is a costume that makes crowds hold still. It is an old lesson and a hard one. A confident young man in a uniform can walk a long way toward a terrible mistake before anyone finds the nerve to put a hand on his chest and say, "Enough." And the distance he can walk is measured exactly by how sure of himself he sounds. Salas sounded very sure. So the line held still and let him walk, and only one old NCO in the tower was already moving, except that the old woman was no longer looking at his face. She had dropped her eyes, calm and flat and clinical, to his trigger finger, to the hand that held her, and she studied it the way she had once studied a target's habits through 1,100 meters of boiling air, with a patience that had nothing of fear in it and everything of professional interest. And something in that flat, unhurried, entirely unafraid glance reached the animal part of the sergeant's brain, the part older than pride, and his hand opened, and he let go of her arm. Prentice was there before Salas's hand had finished falling. The rangemaster put himself between the sergeant and the old woman. Not fast, not dramatic, just there, the way an old NCO occupies a doorway. And when he spoke, his voice had dropped the easy tone he used with families. "Sergeant, you're going to take your hand off that Marine and you're going to stand by." "She's a civilian, Gunny. You don't know what she is." Prentice did not look away from him. "Neither do I exactly. But I know how she cleared that rifle, and I know how she called your wind, so you're going to stand by." Salas's jaw worked. The crowd was watching now, all of them. The joke curdled into something none of them could read, and he could feel it slipping, and a wiser man would have let it slip. He was not, that afternoon, a wiser man. "With respect, Gunny," he said, "you've gone soft. She's an old lady playing dress-up next to a real rifle, and I've got a relay to—" "What's your hold?" Prentice said. He had turned away from Salas entirely. He had turned to the old woman, and he asked it low, almost gently, nodding down the range at the far steel and the bending flags. 800. This wind. Cold barrel. What's your hold, Master Guns?" The old woman answered without a pause, without looking at him, her eyes on the range where they had been the whole time. "First round from a cold barrel always walks a little," she said. 800. This wind. I'd give it 2.5 mils of left wind and favor the low edge, because the cold shot drops before the barrel warms. "Send it." Read the splash, and it settles into the group by the third round. But you only get one cold bore shot in a day that counts. So you make the cold one count. She paused. "You know that, Master Guns. You've called it for somebody." Prentice let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 30 years. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I have." His eyes went down to the cord at her collar, to the dull steel tooth hanging there, and past it, and he knew. He did not say the name, not on an open line, not in front of a rope full of families and a corporal with a phone. He turned back to the sergeant and lowered his voice until it was for Salas alone. "Son, I'm going to give you the only good order you're going to get today. Go up to that tower, get on the phone, and stand your relay down. Do it now, before you finish ending your own career on that boy's video. Because you have put your hands on somebody, and when the rest of this line figures out who, the only thing that's going to save you is that you walked away first. Go." For one long moment it hung there, and it could have gone the other way. Salas could have walked to the tower. The whole rest of his life balanced on it, and he never even knew. But he looked at the rope line, at the families, at his students, at the corporal's phone, and his pride did the arithmetic of a young man who has never yet paid for anything, and he decided the old man had gone soft, and the old woman was a fraud, and the crowd was still his to win. He turned his back on Prentice and squared himself to reassert the line. The rangemaster stepped back. Not beaten. Certain now. He had done what an old NCO can do, which is offer a younger man the door, and the younger man had refused it. "You have no idea who that is," Prentice said to the sergeant's back. Salas laughed. It was the last laugh he would spend that afternoon, and it was a poor investment, though the receipt would not come due for another few minutes. The rangemaster already knew how this ended. The sergeant had been handed one more chance to walk it back, and he was about to spend it. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault so you do not miss what the boy in the pressed cover refused to hear. The desert does not care what year it is. Close your eyes on any hot, open ground, and it comes back whole. And for the old woman in the red jacket, it was always February, and it was always 1991. Gunnery Sergeant Vivian Prewitt, 37 years old, lay on a slope of gravel in the western Iraqi desert with a rifle no one trusted, and waited. She had been there most of 2 days. She and her spotter had crossed the open ground by night, 2 of them and no one else, moving the way scout snipers move, which is to say, barely. A hide scraped into the reverse slope of a low ridge, netting and gravel and patience, and below them, in a shallow wadi, a marine reconnaissance team was pinned and bleeding time. An enemy marksman had them ranged. He was somewhere in the broken ground, across 1,000 meters of nothing. Patient and good. And every time the recon team tried to move, he reminded them he was there, and they could not find him, and they could not stay. And the sun was coming up on their 3rd bad hour. Beside Vivian lay Corporal Russ Deming, 24 years old, her spotter, glassing the far ground through a spotting scope with his cheek in the dirt. "You really think this thing shoots, Gunny?" he whispered. He meant the rifle. The big .50 caliber was new to the war, new to all of them, and half the Corps thought it was too much gun, a novelty, a thing that would break your shoulder and miss. Most of the team still trusted the old bolt guns. Vivian had carried the .50 anyway. "It shoots," she said. "Watch." She had been still for so long by then that her body had stopped belonging to her in the ordinary way. That was the part no one who had not done it could ever understand, the part that could not be taught in any classroom and barely in any field. To lie in one position on open ground under a moving sun, to let the hours go by one at a time, 19 of them once on a different slope in a different country, and to keep your mind bright and your eyes soft and your hands ready through every one of those hours. That was not a skill of the trigger finger. It was a skill of the whole self, a kind of patience that most people never have occasion to learn because their lives never ask it of them. Vivian had learned it young and paid for it in ways she never listed, and it had made her, on the worst mornings, into something closer to the ground she lay on than to the people who moved around above it. She was the stillest thing in the desert. The stillest thing in the desert is the thing that lives. She found the enemy marksman the way you always find them in the end, by his one mistake. He was disciplined, but no man is perfectly disciplined for 3 hours. And at the top of one of those hours, he shifted to ease a cramp, and the morning sun caught 1 square centimeter of something that should not have caught the sun, a lens, or a buckle, or a wet edge, a single wink of light in a fold of ground 1,100 meters away, and it was the same lesson she would throw at a sergeant on a green American range 35 years later. The target always tells you. You only have to be still enough, and patient enough, and unbothered enough to let him. 1,100, Deming breathed, reading it out. All business now. The fear gone into the work. Winds 14, full value, left to right. Mirage boiling. You've got him. Vivian settled behind the rifle. She built the position out of her own bones. She read the wind off the mirage and the far dust, and she dialed her dope, and she waited for the pause between 2 heartbeats, and she pressed the trigger once. 1 round. 1 cold bore round, across 1,100 meters of open desert, from a rifle no one trusted. The wadi went quiet. Down in the shallow ground, the recon team, who had been dying by inches, felt the quiet change around them and understood it, and they moved, and they lived. The rifle that no one trusted had done in a single breath what a company online could not have done, and after that day, they trusted it. And after that day, they told stories about the woman who had carried it, and somewhere in the telling the stories put a call sign on her, Longbow, the one who reached out farther than anyone thought a person could reach. That was the shot. That was the legend. The Silver Star came in a box a year later with a citation, most of which was blacked out. But the desert does not give without taking, and it took its price on the way out. On the exfil, crossing a stretch of open ground they had judged and misjudged, Deming was hit. Vivian did what a person does, which is everything, and none of it enough. She carried him. She carried a grown man and his gear across 800 meters of open desert, with her lungs on fire, and got him to the pickup. And it wasn't in time. And she knew it wasn't in time. Somewhere in the middle of the carry, and carried him anyway, because you don't put a man down while his heart is still trying. They gave her the medal for the shot. She kept only the small steel tooth that had hung around a younger man's neck, the hog's tooth every scout sniper earns and wears, and she took it off him herself. And she wore it every single day after, under her collar where no one could see it, for 35 years. Longbow came home a legend, and then, quietly and deliberately, she buried the legend under an ordinary life, a small house, a garden, a red jacket, an old woman nobody would look at twice. And now, on a sunlit range full of families, a boy with a clean uniform and a loud voice was about to reach out and pull her collar back and let it all out into the daylight. Salas squared himself to the line and made his last decision. He had lost the crowd, and he could feel it. And there is a specific panic in a young man who has never learned that a lost crowd is survivable. And out of that panic, he did the worst possible thing. He decided to physically remove her, all the way, in front of everyone and be done with it. "That's it," he said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the first word. "You and your little fan club are leaving my range. Ma'am, let's go. Now." He reached past Prentice, past the range master's shoulder, and he took the old woman by the front of her jacket, by the collar and the shoulder both, to march her bodily off the line. She could have stopped him. The audience knew that now, in a way the sergeant never would. After the desert, after 1,100 meters, and a cold bore shot, and a man carried 800 meters into the dawn, the whole line knew what those still old hands had been trained to do to a man who laid hands on her, and knew that she was choosing, second by second, not to do it. She chose stillness. She had carried a dying man under fire. The grip of a boastful boy did not frighten her. She let him pull, the way you let a current pull, when you know exactly where the shore is and you are in no hurry to reach it. And his pull dragged the collar of the red jacket open. The worn gray cord came free of the fabric, and the dull steel tooth swung out into the sunlight, turning on its lace. And behind it, pinned to the inside of the lapel where she had kept it half a lifetime against her heart, a small tarnished device caught the light too. A scout sniper's unit pin, crossed rifles and a number, worn nearly smooth with age, but unmistakable to anyone who had ever earned one. The tooth caught the sun. The little pin caught the sun. And Prentice, who had earned neither, but had spent 40 years in the presence of men who had, said one word, and it fell on the line like a dropped rifle. "Stop." For one instant, the old woman's eyes came up. They came up off the gravel and off the range, and they found Salas's face, and they held it, flat and level and professional and wholly, completely unbothered. The eyes of a person who has already survived the worst morning of her life, and found every morning since to be a gift she did not owe anyone an explanation for. And even Salas, who understood nothing, felt the floor of the whole afternoon tilt beneath him, and his hand came slowly off her jacket of its own accord. Resnick's phone was still recording. Private Bowden had gone the color of paper, and the range master's face had changed into something that made even the sergeant go quiet, because it was not anger. It was awe, and awe is far more frightening on the face of an old NCO than rage will ever be. Prentice named it for the line. "That's a hog's tooth," he said, and his voice carried now, because he wanted it to carry. Every man who's ever pinned on crossed rifles knows what that is, and knows you don't get to wear one by playing dress-up. And that pin behind it, he looked at it, and his throat worked. That's a scout sniper detachment that hasn't stood up under that number since the Gulf. He raised his eyes to the old woman's face, and the whole rope line leaned in to hear it. "Your longbow." The murmur went down the line like wind through the far flags. Some of them did not know the name. Some of them, the ones who had gone through the schoolhouse, the ones who had sat in the dark and been shown the old case studies, knew it exactly, and the way they straightened told the ones who didn't that they had better start paying attention. That's not. Salas was shaking his head. "She's an old woman. That's not. You can't just, Sergeant." The new voice came from behind them, from the direction of the display tents, and it did not have to be raised to stop everything. A man was crossing the grass toward the line at an unhurried walk, an aide a pace behind him, and he wore the eagles of a colonel, and he was the base commander, and his name was Grant Whitfield. He was 55 years old, and 30 years before he had been a young scout sniper who had sat in a dark classroom and been shown, as gospel, the case study of a shot across 1,100 meters of Iraqi desert made with a rifle no one trusted. He had built a career on the discipline that shot represented. He had told the story to his own students 100 times. He walked up the line, and he stopped 3 feet from the old woman in the red jacket, and his eyes went to the pin on her lapel, and everything in him that had been a colonel touring an open house quietly went away, and what was left was the young sniper who had memorized her name. He looked at the pin for a long moment. Then he looked at Sergeant Brett Salas, and when he spoke, his voice was level and terrible and quiet. "Sergeant, how do you know this legendary unit?" Salas's mouth opened, and nothing came out. "You don't," Whitfield said. "I do. I built my entire career studying what this Marine did with that rifle. There are lieutenants and captains and colonels across this corps who can recite her cold-bore shot from memory because it is taught. It is taught, Sergeant, as the standard the rest of us reach for. And you have spent the last 20 minutes putting your hands on her in front of these families and calling her Grandma." He let it sit. "You've had your hands on a silver star." He turned to face the old woman fully. And Colonel Grant Whitfield, commander of the base, came to attention on the gravel of his own range, and he raised his hand in a slow, exact salute, and he held it. Down the line, one by one, and then all at once, the Marines came to attention. The students, the young ones, the range staff. Private Wyatt Bowden snapped to so hard his heels cracked. Even Resnick lowered the phone and stood, because some things you do not film, you stand for. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed, and the ones who had been through the schoolhouse recognized it because they had felt it once before, in a dark classroom, when an instructor put a single slide on the wall and said, "This is the standard. This is what one disciplined Marine did with a rifle the rest of the Corps had written off, and this is why you will lie in the dirt until your body forgets it is yours." They had memorized the range, and the wind, and the cold bore hold of a shot, made in a country most of them had been too young to remember. They had said the call sign out loud in formation as a kind of prayer. And it had never once occurred to a single one of them that the person behind that call sign was alive, and old, and standing at a base open house in a plain red jacket, close enough to touch, close enough to grab by the collar. Legends are supposed to be safely dead, or safely far away, so that a man never has to test whether he would have had the sense to recognize one. These Marines had just failed that test in front of each other, and they knew it, and the shame of it stood them up straighter than any order could have. The sergeant's face went through the entire war in the space of 4 seconds. The joke, first, the reflex to grin, then the doubt, then the arithmetic, the slow, horrible math of a young man adding up exactly what he had done, and to whom. And then the fall, when the number came out, and the blood left his face, and he stood alone in the middle of a firing line, that had come to attention for the woman he had dragged by the collar. The range went silent, but for the flag snapping at the 400-meter line, and the old woman, still unbothered, returned the colonel's salute with a small, grave nod, the way a senior returns the courtesy of a junior. And then she looked past all of it to the bench and said, in a plain and level voice, that somebody had better check the headspace on that 50, because the demo bipod was still skewed off the bag, and it had been skewed the whole afternoon. A full firing line stood at attention for the old woman in the red jacket, and the boy who had called her grandma could not lift his eyes off the gravel. It did not take long for the reckoning to arrive, because bad news travels a base faster than any good news ever has. Sergeant Major Lamar Hutchins came across the grass at the flat, fast walk of a man who has heard something over a radio that he did not want to hear, 49 years old, and built like a door, and the crowd parted for him without being asked. He took in the scene in a single sweep: the colonel, the line at attention, the old woman, the sergeant standing alone and gray-faced, and he did not need most of it explained. Sergeant Salas. His voice was quiet, and quiet from Hutchins was worse than shouting. You put your hands on a retired master gunnery sergeant, a Silver Star recipient, in front of families, on my range. He stopped a foot from the man. You are relieved. Get up to that tower, and you stand by, and you do not say one more word on my line. Move. Salas moved. There was nothing else left in him to do. He walked up the line past the students, who would not look at him, and past the private who could not look away. And he went up the tower stairs, and he stood by. And the afternoon that he had tried so hard to owned him instead. And then the old woman stopped it. Sergeant Major. Hutchins turned. So did Whitfield. She had not raised her voice, but they turned. Both of them. The way men turn when the senior person on a range speaks, and the senior person on that range, everyone now understood, was the old woman in the red jacket. Don't end him, she said. Hutchins blinked. Ma'am, I know what he did. She said it gently. He grabbed an old woman by the arm because an old woman made him feel small in front of his students. I've met 100 of him. I've trained some of him into better men than that. He's not cruel, Sergeant Major. He's a boy who never got taught. She looked up toward the tower, at the young man standing gray and alone against the rail. Somewhere along the line, nobody handed him the history. Nobody made him learn the names. And breaking him now won't hand it to him either. It'll just make him bitter. And a bitter man teaches the next boy to be bitter. And that's how you lose a whole line of them. She turned back to Hutchins and to the colonel. Don't end him. Make him learn. Make him learn the names. All of them. The ones on the wall at the schoolhouse. The ones that aren't there because their citations are still blacked out. That's the only punishment that ever fixes anything. Everything else is just you feeling better. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Subscribe to the veteran vault, and let this old woman's grace find the people who need it today. Whitfield looked at Hutchins, and something passed between the two senior men, and the colonel nodded once. He walked up to the tower himself. What he said to Salas, no one on the line could hear. But they saw the sergeant come down the stairs after a while, and they saw him cross the grass to the old woman, and they saw that his face was wrecked in the particular way of a young man who has finally, for the first time in his life, understood the size of something. He stopped in front of her. There was no crowd to perform for now. The crowd had become something else, a quiet ring of witnesses, and he did not perform. Ma'am, he said, and his voice broke on it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I know, the old woman said, and then, because she was who she was, she gave him the only thing that would actually help him, which was the truth about the wind. It was 10 off the left, Sergeant. Quartering. with a fishtail at the berm. You called it center. She let that settle. You'll remember that now. For the rest of your life, every time you step on a line, you'll remember an old woman told you the wind and you called her a fraud. That's a good thing to carry. It'll make you slow down and look at the flags. Slowing down and looking at the flags is the whole job. Then she turned to Private Bowden, the boy who had gone pale, the boy who had never once laughed, and she asked him if he would walk her up to the bench. He walked her up to the bench. She stood over the .50 caliber rifle that had started the whole afternoon, and she reached down and squared the bipod at last, the thing her hands had wanted to do an hour ago, and then she built a firing position over it, out of 40 years of muscle that had forgotten nothing at all. She settled her cheek to the stock. She read the flags one last time, and she sent a single round down the 800 meters to the far steel. It rang. One clean high note across 800 meters of American grass, and it carried back across the whole silent line. The line did not cheer. One cold bore round, one ring of steel, and every Marine on that gravel understood it, too completely to cheer. The line understood, and understanding was louder than any cheer would have been. She stood up off the rifle and handed it back to the private, and she told him, and the colonel, and the sergeant major, and all of them, that the range was theirs again. Gentlemen, and thank you for letting an old woman remember what her hands used to know. Prentice walked her part way because he could not help himself, an old master gunnery sergeant escorting another across the grass, with his hands clasped behind his back, and neither of them said very much, because the ones who have really done it never do. Near the edge of the lot, he stopped and told her it had been an honor to have her on his line, and he meant every ordinary word of it. And she told him he ran a good range and to keep an eye on the young sergeant, that there was something in the boy worth saving if somebody bothered to save it. Prentice said he would. He watched her go the last stretch alone. Behind them, the line was breaking up into low voices, families gathering their children, the sergeant major already talking quietly with the colonel about what came next, and Private Bowden standing where she had left him, with a look on his face like a boy who has just been handed the weight of a thing he will spend years learning how to carry. He would tell the story for the rest of his life. They all would. And every telling would end the same way, with an old woman walking off toward a parking lot in a red jacket, refusing to be anything more, in the sun, on an ordinary Saturday. Then Vivian Prewitt tucked the steel tooth back under her collar, where Russ Deming had ridden against her heart for 35 years, and she buttoned the red jacket over it, and she turned and walked back across the grass toward the parking lot, an old woman again to anyone who did not know, and there was no longer a single person on that range who did not know. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.